Chapter 4. The city rose from the plain like a fist, ugly and defiant against the open sky. Cain built it. I shouldn't have been surprised. He'd always worked with his hands, always fought the ground for what it would give him. But this was different. This wasn't coaxing food from resistant soil. This was reshaping the earth itself, stacking mud bricks, raising walls, carving out streets. A place to belong when God had made him a wanderer. He named the city after his son, Enoch, a name that means dedicated. I wondered what Cain had dedicated him to. I was no longer posted at Eden's eastern gate. Michael had reassigned me after Seth's children began to multiply. The garden still stood, the cherubim still guarded it, the flaming sword still turned. But my work had shifted outward, following humanity as it spread across the land. Watching, guarding where I could. Fighting where I had to. And there was more fighting now. Far more than I'd ever imagined there would be. The fallen had changed their strategy after Cain's exile. Before the murder, they'd worked in whispers. Suggestions, spiritual pressure applied to individuals, hoping to tip a choice. But Abel's blood had emboldened them. They'd proven that humans could be pushed to the worst kind of violence, and now they pressed harder, everywhere, all at once. I felt it first along the borders of Cain's territory. A heaviness in the air that wasn't weather. Shadows moving at the edges of my vision that weren't cast by anything solid. The fallen were gathering in numbers I hadn't seen since Lucifer's rebellion. "Something's building," Hazel told me one evening. He'd been running patrols along the southern perimeter while I covered the east. His face was drawn, tight around the eyes. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I know," I said, staring out across the darkening plain. "I can feel it. Not just here," Hazel said. He sat down beside me on the ridge where I'd been watching Cain's city grow. Everywhere. Michael's pulled half the garrison from the upper regions to reinforce the earthbound posts. Whatever they're planning, it's bigger than anything they've tried before. I looked out at the city below. Fires burned in the streets. I could hear the sound of hammering, metal striking metal. Cain's descendants had discovered how to work bronze and iron. A smith named Tubal-Cain, one of Cain's descendants, made tools. He also made weapons. "They're learning fast," I said, watching the forge light flicker against the city walls. "Too fast," Hazel said, his voice dropping low. "The fallen are teaching them." That was the thing I hadn't wanted to admit. Humans were brilliant on their own. I'd watched Adam name the animals with an insight that startled me. I'd seen Eve discover patterns in the natural world that even I hadn't noticed. Their minds were extraordinary, made in God's image, capable of seeing connections and creating things that hadn't existed before. But the speed of it, the direction of it, cities and weapons and forges within a few generations. That wasn't just human ingenuity. Someone was whispering in their ears, showing them shortcuts, handing them knowledge they shouldn't have had yet. And the music. I need to tell you about the music, because it confused me more than almost anything else. Jubal, another of Cain's line, invented the harp and the flute. I was patrolling the outskirts of the city when I first heard it. A sound so beautiful it stopped me mid-stride. Notes rising and falling, weaving together in patterns that reminded me of worship in the throne room. Of voices lifted before God's presence. Of the songs we sang before the rebellion tore everything apart. A human had created that. From gut and wood and breath, he'd made something that echoed heaven. I stood there listening, and I felt two things at once. Wonder at what they could make. Horror at what they would do with it. Because the songs weren't for God, they were for themselves. For entertainment, for pleasure, for the pride of having made something beautiful. The gift twisted away from the giver before it was even fully formed. That was the pattern I watched unfold over the generations that followed. Everything humans created was brilliant and broken at the same time. I saw it in the music first, then in the tools, then in the cities. Every gift twisted away from its giver. Sin wasn't just in their choices anymore. It was in their culture, woven into the fabric of how they lived. Hazel and I fought our way through those years. Not a single great battle, but an endless grinding campaign of skirmishes and patrols and ambushes. The Fallen probed constantly, testing our lines, looking for weaknesses. Some nights we'd drive back 3 or 4 incursions before dawn. Other nights were quiet, and somehow the quiet was worse. It meant they were planning. I lost Hadale during a skirmish near the eastern settlements. It happened fast. We were driving back a group of Fallen who'd been working among Lamech's people, feeding the violence that was becoming that family's legacy. There were 5 of us, and maybe 8 of them. Bad odds, but we'd fought through worse. Hadale was on my left flank, young for a warrior but steady. He'd been part of the garrison since the Garden period, one of the angels who'd watched creation unfold with the same wonder I'd felt. I'd trained with him, fought beside him, trusted him to hold his position. The Fallen hit us from 2 sides at once. I engaged the first wave, driving my blade into the space between them, creating room. I heard Hadale shout behind me, not a battle cry, something sharper, something wrong. I turned and saw him falling, and everything inside me went cold. The light was going out of him. That's the only way I can describe it. Angels are made from light, from God's word and power, and when we're lost, the light doesn't fade gradually. It collapses, like a star imploding. One moment he was there, fighting, alive. The next, the brightness contracted to a point, and then there was nothing. Nothing where Hadale had been. Just empty air where a warrior used to stand. The loss hit me like a blade through the chest, sharp and total and immediate. I screamed. Not a word, just sound, grief and rage compressed into a force that made the Fallen nearest me flinch. I drove them back. All of them. I don't remember the details. I remember the fury, the sick hollow feeling in my chest where certainty used to be, the need to make them pay for what had just happened. Hazel pulled me back when it was over. His hand on my shoulder, gripping hard enough to anchor me. "He's gone," Hazel said. His voice was flat. The way it got when he was holding grief down where he didn't have to feel it. "I know," I said, and the words came out scraped raw, barely holding together. "You can't bring him back," Hazel said, his grip still firm on my shoulder. "I know," I said, and I hated the truth of it more than I'd ever hated anything. We stood there in the dark. The Fallen had retreated. The settlement below was quiet, its people sleeping through a war they couldn't see. And Hadale was gone, as completely as if he'd never existed. I wanted to ask God why. I wanted to stand in his presence and demand an explanation. Why do we lose our own while the humans sleep? Why do we fight and bleed and die for creatures who don't even know we're here? But I didn't ask. Not because I was afraid of the question, because I already knew what he would say. You'll see, the same answer he always gave, patient and immovable and impossible to argue with. And I wasn't ready for that answer. Not yet. Not with Hadale's absence still ringing in my ears. I saw what Cain's line was becoming the night I found Lamech. He was Cain's great-great-great-grandson, and he'd inherited more than the family name. I was patrolling near one of the larger settlements when I heard a voice carrying through the night air. Confident. Loud. The kind of voice that expects an audience. I moved closer and found him standing outside his dwelling, firelight catching the planes of his face. His 2 wives sat before him, Ada and Zillah, and he was speaking to them the way a man speaks when he wants to be remembered. "I have killed a man for wounding me," Lamech said. He held up his hand, and I could see the cut across his palm. Shallow, the kind of wound that would heal in a week. A young man for injuring me. He was smiling, and the smile was the worst part of all of it. If Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech continued, then Lamech 77 times. Ada lowered her eyes. Zillah stared at him, and I couldn't tell if what I saw on Zillah's face was admiration or fear. Maybe she couldn't tell either. I stood there in the dark and felt a shift inside me. Cain had killed Abel and been destroyed by it. I'd watched his face go blank, watched the horror settle into his bones. Cain had murdered, but he hadn't celebrated. Lamech celebrated. He wore the killing like a trophy, turning it over in the firelight for his wives to admire. He'd taken God's mercy, the protection God had placed on Cain, and turned it into a boast. A dare. Kill me and see what happens. He wore the violence like a crown, and his wives sat at his feet and listened. This was what sin looked like after it had time to grow. Not the tortured guilt of a man who'd killed his brother. The casual pride of a man who'd killed a stranger and wanted his family to admire him for it. The generations kept coming, each one further from the garden than the last. Seth's line grew alongside Cain's, and for a while I could see the difference. Where Cain's descendants built cities and forged weapons, Seth's descendants called on the name of the Lord. They worshiped. They remembered. They taught their children about the God who had walked with their grandparents in a garden that most of them would never see. Enosh, Seth's son, was the first to establish regular worship. I watched him build an altar, simple and rough, nothing like the elaborate structures Cain's line was raising. He brought an offering, a lamb, its blood dark against the pale stone. And I felt God's presence settle over that place, warm and immediate, the way it had felt in the garden. Hope. I let myself feel it again. Maybe this was how it would work. One line faithful, one line fallen. Seth's children carrying the promise forward while Cain's descended deeper into violence. But lines don't stay separate. They never do, not when the pull is strong enough. I watched it happen slowly, over decades that felt like moments. Seth's people saw what Cain's had built. The cities, the music, the comfort, the power. And they wanted it. Not all of them, not at first, but enough. Marriages across the lines, compromises. A slow drift away from the altars and toward the forges. They're mixing, Hazel said, and his voice carried disgust. They're choosing, I corrected him, though the correction brought me no comfort. Choosing wrong, Hazel said, and I heard the finality in his voice. I couldn't argue with that. There was nothing to argue with. There were still faithful ones, there were always faithful ones, but fewer, generation by generation. The sin that had started with one piece of fruit was now a current running through everything, pulling even the righteous toward the dark. And then came the boundary that should never have been crossed. I don't know how to tell you about this part. Even now, after everything I've seen, it unsettles me. Some of the fallen stopped fighting us. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't, because what they did instead was worse. They went to the humans, not as tempters, not as whispered voices in the dark. They went in form, in presence. They crossed the boundary between the spiritual and physical in a way that was never meant to happen. The daughters of men were beautiful. I'd watched humanity grow more diverse, more varied, more striking with each generation. And the fallen saw them too. I felt the violation before I understood it. A wrongness in the fabric of things, like a note played in the wrong key, grating against everything that was supposed to be. The boundary between our kind and theirs existed for a reason. God had made humans from dust and angels from light, and those categories mattered. The fallen didn't care. They crossed the line as if it had never existed. Their offspring were things that shouldn't have existed. I saw the first one from a distance, standing among a group of men near one of the eastern settlements, and my whole being recoiled. He was taller than any human by 2 heads, broad as an ox across the shoulders, but that wasn't what unsettled me. It was the way he felt. Like looking at 2 things forced into the same space. Human and not human. Dust and light crushed together into a form that the world hadn't been built to hold. My skin crawled the way it does near a wound that's gone wrong. Something alive where rot should be. There were more after that, larger than normal humans, stronger. Wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The humans called them Nephilim, giants, men of renown. The humans were impressed by them, awed by their size and strength and the strange power they carried. They became leaders, warriors, kings, and everywhere they went, violence followed. Not the petty violence of Cain striking Abel or even Lamech's proud boasting. This was violence as a way of life, systematic, celebrated, woven into the fabric of every interaction. Michael called us to the upper regions for the first time in years. I hadn't been that far from Earth since the garden. The cold hit me first. I'd forgotten how vast the spaces between stars were, how the silence pressed against you like something physical. We gathered on a point of light so far from Earth that humanity was invisible. A speck on a speck in the darkness. Michael stood before us, and I could see the weight on him. Even archangels carry burdens. Even commanders feel the losses. The corruption is spreading faster than we can contain it, Michael said. His voice carried across the void without effort. The boundary crossings have accelerated. The Nephilim are multiplying. Violence saturates the earth. He paused, looked at us. Hundreds of warriors, battered and worn from years of fighting a war that never seemed to end. God has seen it, Michael said. He has seen that the wickedness of man is great on the earth. That every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts is only evil continually. Only evil continually. The words settled over us like a weight none of us knew how to carry. I thought about Enosh at his altar, about the scattered faithful still calling on God's name. Were they enough? Could a few righteous people balance the weight of all that corruption? What are our orders? Someone asked. I didn't see who. Michael's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted. A heaviness I'd never seen there before. God is grieved, Michael said. Grieved that he made them. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of the void, which is empty. This was a silence full of weight. Full of meaning. God was grieved. The one who had knelt in the dust and shaped Adam with his own hands. The one who had breathed life into clay and called it very good. He was grieved that he'd done it. I felt a crack inside my chest. Not a wound. Deeper than that. What does that mean? I asked. I hadn't meant to speak. The words came out on their own. What happens now? Michael looked at me. Not with anger or impatience, with what might have been pity. I don't know yet, he said, but he's making a decision, and when it comes, we follow it. Whatever it is. We returned to our posts. Nothing had changed on Earth. The Nephilim still walked among humanity. The violence still saturated everything. The faithful still dwindled. But I kept fighting. We all did. Driving back the fallen where we could, holding the lines that still held, protecting the few who still called on God's name. One of those few was a man named Noah, and he changed everything. I noticed him because of how he stood out against everything around him. In a world drowning in violence, he was quiet. In a generation consumed by corruption, he walked with God. Not the way Adam had, not in a garden with perfect intimacy, but in the way a man does when he's decided that the current pulling everyone else toward the dark won't take him. His neighbors thought he was strange. His extended family had largely joined the drift toward Cain's way of living. But Noah built his altar and brought his offerings and taught his sons about a God they couldn't see. I watched him the way I'd once watched Adam in the garden, with hope I couldn't quite justify and a protectiveness I couldn't fully exercise. Hazel found me one night after a particularly brutal fight near the northern settlements. I was wounded, a gash across my side that pulsed with a dull, throbbing pain. Not the loss, but a reminder that it could have been. "You're bleeding," Hazel said, dropping beside me and looking at the wound. "I noticed," I said, pressing my hand against the gash without looking at it. He sat down beside me. We were on a hillside overlooking a valley where fires burned in a dozen settlements. From up here, it almost looked peaceful, beautiful even. You couldn't see the violence from this distance. Couldn't hear the screams. "There's a man down there," I said. "Noah? Have you seen him?" "I know of him," Hazel said. "Righteous, they say. The only one left who genuinely walks with God." "The only one?" I asked, and the question tasted bitter on my tongue. Close enough to the only one. Hazel's voice was hard. Out of millions, millions of them, Kemuel, and one man still faithful, one. I didn't say anything. I was watching the fires, counting the settlements that burned. "This is what they chose," Hazel said. "Every generation, every family, every individual, choice after choice after choice, all leading here. To this." He gestured at the valley, at the burning settlements, at the world that had become a thing God hadn't made. "I know," I said, and the words sat heavy between us like stones on a grave. "Then why do you still look at them like that?" Hazel asked, turning toward me. "Like what?" I asked, though I already knew what he was going to say. "Like you think they're worth saving," Hazel said, and there was something in his voice that might have been pity. I thought about it. About the blood and the violence and the corruption and the Nephilim and Lamech's boast and the cities built on bones and the music that should have been worship. "Because he does," I said, and that was the only answer that mattered. Hazel didn't respond. We sat there together on that hillside, two warriors in a war we couldn't win, watching the world burn slowly from the inside. And somewhere below us, one man walked with God. One man in all the world still faithful. Then Michael came to me. Not to a group. To me alone. That had never happened before. "New orders," he said. His voice was tight, controlled. "What are they?" I asked, reading the tension in every line of his body. He looked at me for a long moment. "God is going to end it," Michael said. I didn't understand at first. "And what?" I asked, searching his face for something that would make the words make sense. "All of it," Michael said. His jaw worked. "Every living thing on the face of the earth. Man and animal and creature, he's going to wipe them clean." The words didn't make sense. I heard them, understood the meaning of each one, but the totality of it wouldn't settle in my mind. All of it. Everything he'd made, everything he'd loved, except Noah, Michael continued, his family, the animals he'll gather, but everything else. He paused. "Everything else dies." I stared at him. Why? The word came out before I could stop it. It was a stupid question to ask a commander. Michael didn't make the decisions. He delivered them. But I'd watched God kneel in the dirt and shape a man with his own hands. I'd watched him breathe life into clay. I'd seen the delight on his face when Adam first opened his eyes, and I couldn't make that God match the one who would drown the world. Michael didn't reprimand me. He just said, quietly, "Because every inclination of their hearts is only evil continually." And it grieves him to his core. Grief, not anger. Not vindication, grief. That was what drove it, the same love that had made them now breaking under what they'd become. God was going to destroy the world because it was breaking his heart to watch it destroy itself. Your assignment is Noah, Michael said. Protect him. Whatever comes, for as long as it takes. How long? I asked, and my voice sounded strange even to me. Michael held my gaze. You'll see, he said, and for once those words didn't feel like a promise. They felt like a warning.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.